This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
So we're going to talk tonight about the language of healing. But one of the things we know about the language of healing is that so much of it is in the receiving. And so just to take a moment now, if you'd like, and let yourselves get settled. I'm sure many of you have had very busy days. Others of you maybe have been outside in this incredible weather. And I invite you to just take a moment to really feel the pleasure of that. Maybe there's a little bit, a sense of the sun left as it's kind of soaking into your skin. Or a feeling of how the air has felt to you today. Maybe having to wear a little less clothing and what that's felt like to be a little more free, a little more unencumbered. And I'd like to begin by sharing a story with you. And this is a story about the north wind and a conversation that he had with the sun one day. And the north wind, it turns out, as you might guess, is quite a blustery fellow, quite full of himself. And so he went up to the sun one day and said, "I am the most powerful thing there is." And the sun very humbly said, "Well, maybe not. I beg to differ. I actually think I may be the most powerful thing." And the north wind said, "Well, let's have a contest." And just then a man walked by wearing a big heavy coat, and the north wind said to the sun, "We'll have a contest and see who can make that man take his coat off first, and then we'll know who's most powerful." And so the north wind naturally decided that he would go first, and he blew and he blew, and he blew as hard as he could. And the harder he blew, the tighter that man held his coat around his body. And finally, he became exhausted, and he went to the sun and said, "Well, clearly, if I can't do it, it can't be done." And so the sun said, "We'll see." And she shone her warm rays down on the man. Gentle, warm rays. And the man walked along, and he let go of his coat, and he let it hang open. And finally he said, "It's such a beautiful day. I think I'll take off my coat." So the language of healing. One of the things about the language of healing that I'd like to talk about first is what it's not. Because sometimes when we start to talk about the language of healing, there's something that we sometimes refer to as New Age guilt. Has anyone heard that term or feel a sense of resonance with it? New Age guilt is that sense that when we start to learn all of these wonderful things about how words can create healing and how what we think can have a positive or negative effect on our experience, or that there's certain things we can do to promote well-being and so on, that what happens is that if we find that we're not doing our definition of healing, for example, if we have a terminal disease and it's not getting better, or even if we have a habit that we find that we can't break, or if we know somebody who we feel should be doing more, then we start to participate in New Age guilt. And so what's intended as healing language ends up being just the opposite, and it ends up being something that we beat ourselves up with. And so as you listen tonight, I really ask that you take it in just in a way that serves. So that if there's anything here that starts to stimulate New Age guilt, please assume that I'm incorrect And you can even ask or let me know. And to really just use tonight what feels like it energizes and strengthens your own sense of compassion and wisdom, and what strengthens your own capacity to heal or to support someone else in their healing. Okay? Any questions about that or anything else so far? So language can create an opportunity for healing or for further supporting old patterns. And the language of healing awakens a person's sense of their own power and compassion, their own wisdom, and a deeper sense of who you are. And in a way, the language of healing, even though we're using words and language to get below the level of words, to get to the level of feeling, of sensing in the body, and to get to those experiences and possibilities beyond identity and beyond what we normally connect with our usual thinking minds. Did you know that? There's no thought without a corresponding reaction in the body? The stronger the emotion that's associated with the thought, the more that this is true. William James said this back in the 1800s. Most of our inner language, our thought, is like an old hypnotic trance that's based on ideas from the past. So most of the language that we're using on ourselves internally on a regular basis is quite negative. It's based, we remind ourselves, we re-induce ourselves, essentially. I'm a hypnotist, so of course I think in terms of hypnosis, but that we're continually re-inducing a trance about certain things that we learned when we were kids. And they may very well not have been true then, and the chances of their being true now are even less. So what effect does this inner dialogue have on the body? First of all, some of you familiar with Candace Pert? Candace Pert worked for many years for the National Institute of Health and at Johns Hopkins University. She's a researcher. She's a neurobiologist, and she's discovered something that she calls the molecules of emotion that some of you might be familiar with. But she's one of the people that discovered that every single cell in our body has a receptor for emotion. And what happens is that if there's a lot of intense emotion that keeps recirculating in the body, what happens is that the cell actually gives up space where it can absorb nutrients to have more and more space for those absorbing the emotions. So our state of being actually changes our brain chemistry, and it affects the functioning of every system in the body. You all familiar with the fight or flight syndrome? Sometimes now we call it fight, flight, or freeze. So what I'd like to do here is just compare what happens in our nervous system when we're thinking a thought that's frightening. And by frightening, I mean there was some research that was done on some of my students that have taken classes from me have heard this, but there was a biofeedback researcher who did some research with women who were typists. And he measured their muscle tension as they were typing in a fairly relaxed state. And say there was a 0 to 10 scale, their tension level would be at about a 3. And what would happen was every 15 seconds, that tension level would drop, and without their even realizing it, their body would take a micro break. And every 60 seconds, they would take a bigger break. And so they were typing along, and their body was doing this for them without their ever realizing it. But then they said to the women, imagine that you're 5 minutes late for work. And what happened was on that 0 to 10 scale, their muscle tension went up to a 5, and they lost those micro breaks. So imagine what that would do over time. You could imagine that that's probably how so many people in our culture get things like carpal tunnel and Of course, that's just what we're talking about with muscles and arms, but depending on what you do or what system you tend to reflect your tension in, you could have all sorts of different issues. So here's some examples of what happens when we're in the fight, flight, or freeze. And again, this happens, our bodies haven't changed essentially since we were cave people. And back then, this was a very useful response because people were generally pretty peaceful unless they were confronted with a saber-toothed tiger or a fire in their cave that had gotten out of hand or something. So you could see that all of these different things that happen would be very useful for them. But this happens again if we're 5 minutes late for work, if someone says something to us that's a little bit disturbing, all different kinds of ways that this happens. And so you can see the comparisons. Every system is impacted. Our eyes dilate. What happens in our digestion is that we get a shot of acid that is supposed to help us digest our food very, very quickly, and then nothing. So people who are stressed over time, obviously we're seeing a lot of things like acid reflux and IBS, or people who have just the opposite. They feel that they can't digest their food at all, and so they go on more and more limited diets. And with the relaxation response, when we're just in a very neutral, peaceful state, then all the things on the other side happen. Our systems come into a state of balance and equilibrium, and each system receives exactly what it needs. The other thing that happens that I'd like to mention is that in the fight, flight, or freeze, one of the things that happens is that, like for example, if suddenly a saber-toothed tiger walked into your cave, nothing else would matter except that saber-toothed tiger, so your vision would narrow. And your mind, your thinking, would become very narrow as well. It would become totally focused on the problem, right? And you would stay in that state until you resolve the problem. But of course what happens for us is that our problems are not so direct, and so we can end up staying in that very, very focused state. Like, have any of you had the experience where you were at home and you're working on your computer and you get more and more and more connected to the screen, and all of a sudden you realize that you've completely lost track of everything that's going on around you? And probably to some extent you've gone into fight, flight, or freeze state. All of your systems have probably shifted a little bit. Your breathing has probably gotten constricted. Your heart rate has probably changed a little bit. Your digestion, your posture, everything has started to shift. And so to get back into the relaxation response is a big part of what happens through the language of healing. Any questions so far? Yes, hi.
Would playing video games likely bring on the fight, flight, or freeze state?
Highly likely.
Highly.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there a little antidote?
Yes.
Besides not doing it?
Besides not doing it.
I'm thinking of young people.
Yes.
It's hard to get them to stop.
Yes. Boy, it really is hard, isn't it? Because there are things they could do, but the question is whether they would be willing.
Yeah.
And certainly some of the things that they could do would be to, sit straighter. Often that helps the relaxation response if our energy can run clearly through the body. And, be aware of the things that are going on outside of them. But of course they get so engaged that the other thing they can do is just, when they're done, really let go. Do some physical activity. Things like that can be really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Before I go on, I'm really curious, what drew you here? What would you like to learn tonight, or what would you like to hear about? Any special interests or requests?
Well, I was interested in about the inner dialogue and the negative
Yes.
dialogue, because I know stuff that was running me, and I'm not almost sure what the dialogue is or what the flavor is, and how to distance myself from it.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else?
I'm interested in how to overcome the fight, flight, freeze response.
Okay, great. We'll talk some more about that.
And I'm interested in caregiving. forgiving and dealing with my own thinking how things should be.
Okay. And Isa, I think.
I just had an interesting thought.
Uh-huh.
It seems to me that if you have a thought, you have to believe the thought. It's a preposition, I'm not sure what the answer is, but does one, I'm thinking one needs to believe the thought to have it actually have a reaction in the body, because
Yes.
sometimes we try to have thoughts
Mm-hmm.
that are positive, but we don't really buy them.
Yes. Yes.
So there's something about really kinesthetically experiencing and embodying the thought. There's a synapse connection in that, I would think.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious if you have.
Yes. Yes. Did everyone hear what Isa said? She was kind of far in the back. Good. Okay. Yeah, it's a really great point.
I lived most of my life in a fight, flight, or freeze state. So learning, it's so hard to learn to change that. The beginning,
Yes.
learning the beginning steps of how to begin to change from that to that.
Okay. Good. Yes. Anyone else?
Can you say what the neurophysiological or endocrine system responses are that are associated with those two different
Yes.
conditions?
Yes. So the
Like, for
neurophysiology.
instance, the
Mhm.
first one is like an adrenal
Yes.
response, as an example.
Yes. Yes.
Simplistically speaking.
Simplistically speaking, exactly. Yes, the adrenal response is a huge part of the fight, flight, or freeze. And so what happens, most of you know what that adrenal response feels like. Now they're starting to talk about cortisol and the effects that it has on the brain. First thing that happens is that, again, one of the things that happens in the mind is that when the cortisol is active, it affects our memory. Because again, if you're faced with a saber-toothed tiger, your brain is not interested in storing a great deal of information. What it's interested in is your immediate response. And so when there's cortisol happening in the brain, there's actually something that the official term is dumping. And what it is that if there's information in your brain at that time, it will literally get rid of it. It won't bother to spend any energy taking what you're learning into your long-term memory from your short-term, because it does take a certain amount of your energy. And so as a result, have any of you found this, that when you're in fight, flight, or freeze, that you get kind of forgetful? That on one hand the mind is racing like crazy, but on the other hand you can't remember what you did 5 minutes ago or why you walked into the room?
Often people will blank out what they might have experienced under traumatic circumstances.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's
Maybe
right.
They might even still have it imprinted in their bodies somehow, but
Mhm.
it's no longer accessible.
Yes. Yeah. So the mind really does start to work differently when there's been a lot of stress. And then, of course, what happens over time is that another thing about the brain is that it's intended to be very helpful to us, but the brain makes it easier and easier for something that happens a lot to happen again. So in other words, if we're in that fight, flight, or freeze a lot, our brain actually makes those pathways more efficient so that we startle and tense more quickly. And so there are ways, and again, that's what we'll talk about, that has so much to do with the language of healing. And does that answer your question? Was there more that you were?
Juxtaposed to that would be
Uh-huh.
what's going on in the body under the relaxation,
Yes.
healing impetus.
Yes. Well, first of all, with relaxation, well, actually, let me go. I'm just going to follow right along here, and I think this will answer your questions. Is that probably a lot of people, I didn't prepare a lot on this in Ashland because I think that probably a lot of you are very familiar with this, but do you know much about the right brain and the left brain? Probably, I'm seeing some nods, and you know that the left brain is considered a lot more logical and linear, and that the right brain is considered much more creative. Okay. Well, first of all, I would just like to say to defend our poor left brain, because so many of us think that, you know, the right brain and the creativity and the intuitive sensibilities and so on are so valuable, is that people who are more right brain oriented have a higher incidence of depression. So there's something about that left brain of being able to be logical and linear and practical that's really important. But we'll just put that aside for now, because what we've discovered now that we have the capacity to do brain scans is that when people are traumatized, the emotional center of the brain is in the middle of the brain, right next to the memory centers. So right away you can start to get a feeling that there's a connection there. And then of course our instinctual part of the brain is at the brain stem. We actually have that part of our brain in common with even lizards have a brain stem that's similar to ours. And then at the frontier are the frontal lobes. The left is the higher reasoning center of logic and so on, and the right of creativity. But what we see on brain scans is that when somebody has been traumatized and that trauma is re-stimulated, that their emotional center on a brain scan appears to be smaller and frozen. And you'll actually see it if you see a brain scan that's real time. You'll see the brain, the waves are constantly, it's a beautiful sight. They're constantly moving and exchanging. It almost looks as though there's a flow of information that's going from one part to the other. But someone who's been traumatized, you'll see that that part is isolated. It's no longer sharing information. So you hear about people, for example, who've been in therapy for many years or who have tried many, many things in order to heal. And what's happening is that in all these processes that they're trying so hard to utilize, they're not able to get that traumatized emotional center to participate in the healing. But what we discover, and this again has so much to do with the language of healing, is that when we activate this creative, intuitive, non-linear right brain, when we use language that's timeless and symbolic, that emotional center starts to open and you actually watch the information start to change, and that center starts to, again, I'm using my own feeling words to describe this, but it appears to soften and it literally expands, and you watch it as it starts to do this instead of this. So that's one of the things that we know about the language of healing, is that the right brain plays a very important part, but that in another way we also really want to honor the left brain and that capacity for logic. And really, like, if you know people who are very left brain, one of the things that you might see about them is that they are very practical and reality based, right? Which is a quality that is very, very valuable in healing, is to be able to be very much connected with the present moment. So that even though imagery and incredibly beautiful images and symbols can be so valuable, that capacity to just really simply be present right here is also a very, very important thing to cultivate, and that we can use language to help support. The other thing that we've learned is that indirect suggestion is very, very helpful. So you know the old thing let's see, it was a long, long time ago, a man by the name of Emile Curie developed this thing that I'm sure many of you have heard. It was the first positive affirmation. In every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Anybody tried a version of this? Yeah, did it help? Not so much, right? It's like if we just tell ourselves these things, it's exactly what Isa was saying, which is that if we don't have that felt, embodied experience, if we aren't able to make connections with all the different parts of our brain, we can say positive statements to ourselves until we're green, and we're not actually going to get much of a result. But what we've learned is that indirect suggestion, and again, we'll go into this a little bit more later, sets up a search pattern in the brain. And again, as you watch a brain scan, you literally see all the different parts of the brain lighting up and sharing their information. So this community of ours that's in our head, all of the different things we've learned, all of our different capacities for growth and change, all of the different connections that we can make, resources that we may use in one part of our life but somehow haven't realized that we could use in another, can come into play when we use the right kind of language to speak to our inner selves. I had an experience very recently. I moved into a new house, and in the kitchen it has these fantastic cupboards. Any of you who love to cook will really relate to this. You open up these huge cupboards, and there are these drawers, and they're this wide and this deep, and they pull out. And so I'm putting all my food and laying all my little cans in there, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with my pots and pans. And it actually took a friend coming over and saying, you can put your pots and pans in there. And somehow or another, I had thought you couldn't put pots and pans in these kind of drawers. I don't know why, but it had never occurred to me. And so I just marveled at how my brain knew all sorts of wonderful things to do with pots and pans, but I couldn't make the leap to that one. So another thing that we've learned about changing, and this might help with your question, is that when we've used a particular pathway in the brain or used a particular pattern, for example, a pattern of thinking over and over about certain things, something happens in our brain, which is those pathways that information traverses literally become easier to traverse for that information. So unfortunately, this is true whether the information is positive or negative. One of the things that we've learned is that in order to stop using those paths, it's not just a matter of saying a positive statement over and over, but actually we can start to develop roadblocks, sort of internal little arrows that say, detour, move this way, and that by doing that as part of our healing practice, it can start to create a big difference in the brain that we don't get if we don't make use of that knowledge. The other thing about language in the brain is that our brain, when we're given new information, it looks for old information that's similar. And so, again, what can happen is that if the old information that we're used to thinking about, and that we've got nice, great superhighways that the information can traverse very easily, that says, oh yeah, I'm never very good at that. Or, oh, see, yeah, people really don't like me that much. Or, yeah, I just don't do very well in that situation. And then your brain very thoughtfully brings up all those other situations that could back up that theory. And so the other thing we can do with the language of healing is start to elicit those other kinds of experiences that we've had. I see a big smile back there. Hello. So we start to really focus on what else, because the truth is that we've had so many experiences, and so many of them go through a sorting process and get pushed off to the side when actually some of those are the most valuable ones that we could be using. So any questions so far? Any comments? I'll bet there's people in this audience that know a lot about this. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Yes,
So you're going
please.
to tell us how to set up these roadblocks to put these new
Yes, yes, I am. So I'd like to share a little bit with you about research on words and healing. And the Mayo Clinic reports on some research that was done with PET scans of brains and imagination. And as I said at the very beginning, a big part of the language of healing is not only in the giving, but in the receiving. It's not only in the speaking, but in the hearing. And so what they've discovered is that when a person is able to go into a deeper, more receptive state, and this is the beginning of the answer to that question, is that this is where change can take place. Because you've probably heard that the brain can't tell the difference very well between what's happening in this reality and what's happening in our imagination. Thank you. So the first thing we can do right now, and an example of the language of healing, is that, again, one of the ways of receiving what we hear that is so important in terms of creating change is how we listen. And one of the things that we can do that's so helpful is something that's called imaginative absorption. And so perhaps if you like, I invite you to practice that now as you're hearing what I'm saying. So not only listening with your intellectual mind, but there's a way that we can listen where we're actually feeling what's being said as well. So there's some way that we open the body, open the qualities of feeling, and so that we allow things to come in on all of those different levels. And so, of course, that's also one really good way to leave out some of the other things that are happening that we're not so interested in focusing on. So a lot of you, in terms of imagination and reality, is, for example, if each of you were to think about your favorite food right now, and if you just thought of that particular food, probably nothing much would happen. But if you really allowed yourself to become fully absorbed in your memories of experiencing that food, your body would actually start to produce the digestive enzymes in your stomach that are needed to produce that, to digest that particular food. You'd actually start to produce some saliva, right? And so perhaps right now we could take just a moment. I know you've been listening to a lot of information. And to take just a moment to just allow it to absorb, just a moment to let everything settle. And so one of the things you can do first is just check on your posture and how you're sitting. And just notice if you're sitting comfortably or if there's some way that you'd like to change your posture. And perhaps you could also take a minute, if you'd like, just focusing inward on your breathing for a moment. Our breathing is such a wonderful anchor to the deeper places inside. Such a wonderful path out of the thinking mind and into a fuller, more present-centered experience. So just simply feeling for a moment the sensation of breathing in and breathing out. And perhaps if it feels comfortable, allowing the breath to deepen a little bit. Not having to force that or having to do anything special at all, but just simply allowing the breath to deepen, perhaps by allowing the abdominal muscles to relax a little bit more, or the diaphragm. And perhaps as you do that, just feeling yourself settling in a little bit more fully into your chair. Perhaps even feeling the support of the chair a little bit more fully. And then taking a moment now to breathe in as well and to become aware of your hands and your arms, of your feet and your legs. And if you find that you're a person that feels emotionally charged up a lot when you start to connect in with your body, by feeling into your hands and feet and arms and legs, you can connect in with your body in a way that you're connecting with more neutral parts of the body. So that it may be a way of becoming more grounded and present without feeling like you're eliciting a lot of emotion. And if you like, you can, I notice many of you closed your eyes. You're welcome to stay with your eyes closed, aware of your breath, aware of your body. And at the same time, continue to listen. Perhaps even discovering a new way of listening. Some other exciting research that's been going on recently in relationship to the language of healing and to some of the things that we've been talking about with the brain is that we used to think that the DNA was completely static, that what you see is what you get. And so that whatever was being expressed through your DNA was basically all there was to the story. But now what we're realizing is that the DNA can actually be woken up by new experience. So what that means is that you may have experience in your DNA, in your genetic code, that right now is not being available. But that as you start to awaken to different kinds of experience, it will actually stimulate that information in your DNA. Isn't this exciting? So there's some other research that I'd love to share with you. Again, I'm familiar with the research on hypnotherapy, which is one way of using the language of healing. And that's related to recovery from surgery. And what we've discovered is that people who receive hypnotherapy before surgeries, and sometimes during surgeries in addition to the anesthesia, recover on the average of 4 to 7 days faster, spend an average, this is for a particular kind of surgery that they discovered, an average of about $750 less per hospital stay, had fewer complications, and recovered more fully. They also required less anesthesia during their surgeries. So I'd love to share with you experience that I had recently, because you know how we've been talking about receiving the language of healing, and I've always felt that anesthesia could be considered a deep trance, where maybe what's happening when someone is under anesthesia is that the personality, that busy thinking mind of ours, becomes quiet, so much so that the person isn't so aware of their external reality. But occasionally I've had the wonderful fortune of being able to go into surgery with people that I've worked with. And there was a woman last year who I went into surgery with, and it was a surgery that the surgeon had warned me in advance often had some problems with a lot of bleeding. So he wanted me to be aware of that. And then at one point during the surgery, he, this wonderful man who has a lot of faith in the language of healing, said to me, "Rochelle, I can't see. Make her stop bleeding so much." And so I said the first thing I could think of, which is to allow her bleeding, her process of circulation, to become very quiet. And so that she could allow her circulation. And this is someone who's under general anesthesia, right? So she's not nodding and smiling and saying she's heard. General anesthesia, supposedly completely out. And just started to speak to her about her circulation becoming quiet and still, and that she wasn't doing a lot of activity right then, so she didn't need a lot of movement in her circulatory system, so that it becomes very, very peaceful and gathered in her heart. And the next thing that happened was the anesthesiologist, who was watching the monitor said her temperature has dropped 3 degrees in the last 5 minutes. And the surgeon said, "Oh, thanks, Rochelle, I can see now." But what we did then was we covered her with warm blankets and gave her another suggestion, which actually the nurse thought of, which was that she could absorb the warmth from the blankets. So this was a whole group of people working with this person on the language of healing. And as a result, she had a very successful surgery and she had a very quick recovery. So that's a personal story, but of course the research on hypnotherapy and this just is so helpful.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you know any dentists that use hypnotherapy in their practice in Ashland?
No, I don't. I wish they did. I know some wonderful, I just completed a training in medical hypnotherapy. We have some wonderful hypnotherapists that can help somebody with that, but I don't know any dentists that do that now. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? So, what is a symptom? Have you ever heard of this definition? A symptom is an aspect of self or experience that's not blessed by human awareness. This is an almost quote from a wonderful man by the name of Stephen Gilligan, but I just felt that it describes so beautifully what it is, because really when we define something as a problem, it's because for some reason we're not able to bless it as part of our experience, right? Like I've actually worked with people who have had cancer who have just said, and I literally, if this is what God wants for me, then here I am. It's so touching. I have to pause after that one for a moment. But, of course, it runs the gamut, of how much we can receive things. So 2 things happen with symptoms. And when symptoms are brought into this realm of acceptance and caring, change is possible. And there's 2 kinds of change. One is changing a context. So in other words, when we're given a challenge, just simply by changing how we relate to it, to some extent we change it. Right? Do you know what I mean by that? So like say, for example, what is it? Anybody here have kids that went through a difficult period? Or are a kid that's going through a difficult period with your parents? So in that moment you're saying, oh, I want them to be different. I wish something different would happen. And then of course with kids, they grow and mature, and then at some point you realize this was an important part of the process. I know when I was a kid, my parents certainly thought that about me. And I look now at the different things that I went through, and I learned so much. And then of course illnesses, mental challenges, emotional challenges, each one of those is immediately transformed just by that simple act of blessing it with our awareness. So that doesn't mean liking it. It doesn't mean loving it. It just means that we're willing to sit with it, willing to bring our awareness to it, our human awareness. So that also means not spiritualizing it, but with all of our whole experience actually being present with it, automatically things start to change. So that even if the symptom itself doesn't change, even if that thing still continues to happen, we feel differently about it. We have a different relationship with it. We live our lives differently in relationship to it. But the other thing that happens is that we're able to bring more of our strength, our compassion, and wisdom. We're able to gather our resources, to drop deep inside, to discover more resources, to bring resources that we didn't even realize we had. And in doing so, we're actually able to change some symptoms directly.
Rochelle, can you say what you mean by not spiritualizing it?
Thanks. Yeah. What I mean by not spiritualizing it is that again, I've worked with people, for example, that have cancer, and people with cancer have been told a lot that A, they've created it through their negative thinking, and B, they have to stop thinking negatively and start thinking positively, or they'll die. And so they come in and they have a smile frozen on their face sometimes, and they feel like they have to be cheerful, but cheerful, and by that they mean trying to rise up out of and get away from anything that feels negative, because they're terrified that they'll harm themselves if they just come into their bodies and into their experience and really sense and feel into what's really happening for them and say, I'm frightened, or this really hurts, or I hate Western medicine, or any of these different things that people do go through when they have an illness that's very severe. And, you know, in this culture, we don't know how to treat people very well who have any kind of sickness, mental, emotional, or physical. Did you know that a schizophrenic person has a better prognosis if he goes to a shaman and lives in an indigenous culture than he does if he goes through the modern Western medical system? This is in the psychology books at universities. This is a medical statistic. Yeah, so we're not doing so good. So that's why we're trying to learn as much as we can about the things we're talking about tonight. So does that answer your question?
Yeah,
It's really letting these things flow through us. So symptoms can happen when, and please again remember what I've said about New Age guilt. I'm not inferring to every difficult thing that happens to us, but more again how we respond to them. But they happen when cognition is negative. So if our felt, like Isa was saying earlier, if our felt thinking experience is negative, then it really can make us sick in different ways. If our sensing, feeling body is not lived in, so that so many of us do feel kind of disconnected, like we're talking heads. We're just walking around living from here up and not even being so aware of what's happening in our body until the messages become quite dramatic. And the third thing is out of connection with what I'm referring to now as the field, which is out of connection with something greater than ourselves. So for people who are religious or spiritually oriented, this could be the divine. It could be something we call God or goddess. But it could also be nature. It could be our sense of community. It could be a connection with creativity or archetypal qualities. So there's all different ways that people sense the field and talk about the field. It could be nature. But the important thing is that we feel that there's something outside of our own individual little self that we can connect with and that we feel nourished and supported by. So each symptom is an opportunity for deeper learning. Inside each symptom are the seeds of a new, expanded identity. So what I mean by that is that usually if we're not willing to bless something with our awareness, it's because somehow we feel that that's not a part of us. It shouldn't be happening to us. Or if it is a part of us, well, it really shouldn't be, right? And so in order to be with it, what's really being asked of us is that we expand our identity to become something that can embrace and hold whatever that is that's presenting itself for our awareness. And so to discover this new expanded identity, this opportunity for deeper learning, a new context must be created where the symptom can be met and held. So, for example, right now, anybody else here, you brought up, I'm referring to you because I think you were speaking for everybody here, because what you spoke about earlier is the epidemic, isn't it, of the West? Is anybody else here, just you can acknowledge to yourself if you feel sometimes like your mind is spinning, right? You're seeing lots of nods. So what about just for this moment, if you connect again with your breath and your body like we did earlier, maybe feeling your hands on your feet. Now simply becoming aware, and perhaps you might be interested to see that your posture very naturally changes and your feeling of being, even that the field that's the chair, even perhaps feeling a little bit more support from the chair. And then just imagining, just for this moment, that thoughts are like leaves on a river, and you're sitting on the bank. So breathing and feeling your body. And perhaps just a little more openness for a kind of soft center to emerge. A sense of your life force as it flows through you. I know this can seem a little abstract, but just whatever part of that actually makes sense to you, just seeing if you can connect with that a little bit. Some people feel that as a kind of center in their belly. Some feel it as the place the breath moves to inside the body before it becomes an exhale and moves back out. Because sometimes the thoughts begin to spin when it's difficult for us to be with our felt experience. So we kind of move up and out of our awareness of what's happening in the body and move up into the head. That's one possibility. And so just seeing perhaps if very, very gently you can just start to be aware of what's happening in your body and perhaps what's happening in your feelings. And just imagining for a moment the possibility of bringing just a little bit more compassion, a little bit more of a sense of blessing and opening your awareness, expanding a little bit to allow an inclusion of whatever it is you're experiencing. Just imagining for a moment that that was possible, and even that it could be natural and easy. And so that without having to change anything, you can open your eyes or not and just continue to listen to what you're hearing. So already by doing this, you're starting to create a new context, a new expanded sense of who you are and of what you can hold, what you have room for. You know how when you're with a little child and you know how if they, for example, they skin their knee or something like that and they just cry with their whole being. And if you just hold them, just simply hold them, gradually that will subside and they'll wiggle off your lap and run off and play, and the whole thing has been worked through, and they're on to the next thing, present with whatever is happening next, right? And this is what we're talking about, is doing that for ourselves, because you've probably, especially the men in here, when you were kids, probably if you fell and you started crying, did someone say to you, cut that out? right? You're not supposed to do that. And then what happened? Right? Yeah. And so this is often what we continue to do, male and female. What we continue to do to ourselves is just tell ourselves that we can't feel it and we shouldn't feel it and so on. So it's just part of the process then. And then we go up into our heads trying to figure out how to manage all of these different things because we can't let them flow naturally. It takes a huge amount of energy to do that. It causes our muscles to tense. It puts us into that fight, flight, or freeze syndrome. All kinds of different things happen. And of course, we become more and more out of contact with that soft center inside ourselves that life really flows through. It becomes kind of tightened down. So one of the antidotes to the thinking mind, and of course for everyone it can be a little bit different. So if this doesn't feel like what's most helpful for you, please let me know. I have many suggestions, things that work for different people. But there's that possibility of just seeing if you can just start to expand your sense of who you are to allow that life force to flow through, for things to start to soften some. So just as we're saying, the distressing quality of a symptom often lies in our inability to hold it and meet it. And the symptom asks us to expand our sense of self and identity, growing to be able to hold the symptom in a new way, responding to it in a way that's healing and growthful, and in turn, it allows us to become more expanded people, to be more connected with all of the different energies and possibilities that are available. So making a space for it, believing it has value, and again, this is a process. It's not a New Age concept that, okay, now every time you confront something difficult, you should start right now because I said so, believing that it has value. But just that it's something to consider, that even the things that are most painful might even possibly, if you just start to hold it in a different way, that you might discover something new about it. And then changing that context. So here's our bottom line, right? Here's why you all came tonight, is how to speak to the body so that it can understand. So now when I say speak to the body, I'm talking about physical symptoms, but I'm also talking about the fact that we think of our mind as being here, but isn't it also true that our mind is in our heart and our mind is in our body? And so it's starting to awaken that felt sensing mind as well. So first, it's by starting to bring the primordial and archetypal realms into consciousness. And again, what I mean by this is that often our identity is quite limited. Like I think, if we think, well, let me just explain. The idea of archetypes is that in some way that's not personal, there are greater ideals, greater energies that are available for us to connect with. And that it seems that each of us somehow identifies with a certain one. Like probably if you look at me, you guess, I'd say I'm probably most identified with a kind of mother archetype. I'm round and warm and gentle. And I know for me, the archetypes that I hope to grow into and expand into are warrior archetypes. And for example, someone called me today who I felt was asking me questions on the phone that really didn't feel quite right. And I knew that it wasn't a, oh yes honey kind of situation. It was needed to be really direct. And I said to this man, I need to stop you now. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, these are some things that I need to have included. So there's the warrior archetype. And this was not easy for me when it gradually gets easier and easier. And I hope that each of you is aware as well that there's probably one archetype that you've already got your PhD in, right? That you just do so beautifully and so naturally and that you can connect with so easily. And that the growing edges are all those other places. And that chances are, hello, if you look at your symptoms, that you'll see that they're probably asking you to grow in exactly those directions. So the other is not focusing exclusively on the conscious thinking mind. I was reading today that in Zen, they say that rather than trying to stop the mind, which is impossible, just become a little less attached to your opinions. I've been trying that today. It's great. So again, just not focusing quite so much, maybe again considering, like just as we said earlier, to consider the possibility that your symptoms have value, to consider the possibility that your thoughts do not, or at least not have the value that you've given them all these years. The next is, again, from Stephen Gilligan. He says it so beautifully, communicating with and listening to the soft center through which life flows. And we can feel very naturally that for most of us, this is probably not in our heads. So how can we use language to create change? So one of the things that I discover as someone who works with people who want change is not only am I trying to create an experience of deepening in them, is that I'm hoping to speak from that place deep inside as well. Because if I'm speaking from that deep place inside, very naturally it's going to touch more fully that place in the other person. So this applies when we're speaking to someone else, but it applies when we're speaking to ourselves too. So one of the things that we can do is just begin to recognize when we're speaking in our mother's voice, or our father's voice, or some conglomeration of voices from the past. And just by creating that deep intention, just by that willingness to be 1% more open, just 1% more curious, and a little 1% less believing our thoughts, automatically we're going to start dropping deeper and deeper, because to live from that place is actually more natural. So really what we're doing is just finding ways that if we imagine that even though we hate these minds of ours and all of this activity, that in some way we're actually clinging to it, that these are all just little ways that we can start to soften that grip, start to feel that we can really have something that we can drop back into, something that will catch us and hold us in a more nourishing and full kind of way. Another is allowing and inviting all parts of self into the conversation. So all those positive affirmation people, I'm here to tell you now, don't worry about it. It's, if you actually look at the research, which as you can tell, I happen to love my left brain to some extent, is that when they look at people who are optimistic, who they base all these ideas on, the truth is that they feel so good about themselves that they allow all kinds of things to emerge. They allow negative things to emerge and positive things to emerge. And the thing about them is that they're not so identified with that. So there's one person in my life who I consider a model for optimism. And he's someone who says, if people say to him, you know, oh, I feel so bad about this and that, he says, oh, I think things like that all the time. I just don't take them very seriously. So he's not forcing himself to think in positive ways. It's exactly the opposite, is that his space, the space in which he invites different aspects of himself, is huge. His embrace is enormous. And as a result, there's all kinds of things that are flowing through, and they mean very little to him. So we change the relationship to the symptom, and we allow it to transform. So the language of healing supports a deepening, a softening, and an expanding. It invites sensing and feeling. It holds the problem in a way that's supportive and healing so that it can be transformed and integrated. And there's something else here, which again I think Isa spoke about so beautifully earlier, is that understanding actually follows experience. So often when we're trying to change something, we go up into our minds and we try to figure it out. But if you think about the things that you really know in a very deep way, and the experiences that have brought you understanding that has been truly transformative for you, you'll realize that it was an experience. And somehow, by some grace, you were able to have an experience that then you're able to say, oh, now I see. So the language of healing should help you to have that deeper experience, right? Like even as I've been speaking tonight, some of you may be saying, oh, I've gotten some good information, and I hope that you have, and I know that that's really wonderful. But the other thing is that I hope you go away with some things that maybe aren't even intellectual yet, but some little feeling that you find that you can connect with later that helps you in your healing, in your own transformation, in your own ability to start to soften those edges of identity so that they can include more and more. The language of healing cultivates strength and compassion. So here's a good barometer for you, because sometimes that guilt that we were talking about earlier can be very tricky. It comes in all sorts of wonderful disguises, and as soon as you've revealed one of them, it gets another great disguise. You can tell if you're getting advice from your inner self and it feels contracting, it's probably your inner critic. Even if it sounds like the most beautiful, spiritual, reasonable language in the world. If it's the language of healing, you should feel a sense of softening and strengthening. And it's discerning without being judgmental. You know the difference between discernment and judgment? That's a good study, isn't it? Not being judgmental doesn't mean you have to accept everything. So the language of healing reorganizes elements of experience into a new pattern. So in other words, many people in this room, I'm sure, have experienced trauma. Did you know now that 65% of Americans are on some sort of daily medication? Did someone have a question about that?
For trauma or anxiety or depression?
Yes, one of those, or pain, but they're taking, 65% of people. So that means that in this room, over half of the people are on some sort of daily medication. So there's areas of experience that are very, very painful, but the thing is that now, for many of us, those experiences are overwhelming, and they're like a veil that walks in front of us and informs all of the different experiences that we have, so that any new experience gets fit into those brain pathways and patterns rather than into other pathways that can hold them and interpret them and work with them in ways that are more healing and transformative. So we cultivate and bring into awareness even existing strengths and resources. I'm sure everyone in this room has so many strengths and resources that you don't even believe. Just like my kitchen. Plenty of room for pots. Who would have known? So supports stillness, openness, and spaciousness. Allows new perceptions and understandings to emerge. Creates space between the ideas of who we are and how we should be, or even how we can be. So often there's something that we sometimes call a therapeutic conversation, and it's that capacity to just create a little space between all these identities. So there's who we are, and then there's who we should be, right? Like, oh man, I really should stop sleeping that late. You know, I should be getting up at 6 and doing yoga, and you know, then I should go to bed at 9 and I should meditate for a half hour before each night, you know, or whatever it is. So just finding a little space between that identity of who we should be and who we feel that we are. Because it's within that space that that new information and those resources that we already have and haven't identified yet can really start to emerge, can enter the light of day. The language of healing invokes our inner selves and our connection to something greater than ourselves, and it's highly personal. So there's no formula. There's things we know that help a lot of people, but it's still very, very personal. It's always about what works for us. So the language of healing is not only in the speaking, it's also, as I said earlier, in the receiving. And so even if it's receiving your own language of healing, the first thing is just allowing yourself a moment of relaxation. And literally, even nanoseconds are helpful, and they build, and gradually the scales begin to tip. So just even that moment of signaling yourself that you can start to relax, of starting to make some connections with things that feel grace-filled to you, of things that feel supportive, of things that allow you to drop inside, of things that allow you to feel safe or protected. We know that when we can absorb ourselves in our inner experience, that can be very, very helpful in the healing process. That if we engage the senses as well as the thinking mind, so that even if you just give yourself that opportunity to just even pay attention to the breath as you're listening to this talking, or feel your body in the chair, or somehow allow yourself to have a felt experience as well as an intellectual experience, that even just those qualities, without having to hear something especially brilliant or meaningful even, but even doing that starts to change the field, change the context in which the symptoms are being held. The next is to open to the flow of life. It's very difficult for transformation to occur if we're contracted and sometimes called armoring, and this is physical as well as emotional and mental. As we said earlier, when we're in that fight, flight, or freeze state, one of the things that happens is that our mental capacities literally narrow, and we're simply not available in the same way to new material. Haven't you discovered sometimes that you're very, very busy and you get really engaged with something and you're starting to get more and more tense, and someone that you love comes up and says, oh, and even wants to, give you a hug or say something nice, and you turn around and snap at them, say, not now, I'm busy, and then you realize later, well, which of those things was actually more important? And you realize that you chose the wrong one. It's to open to the flow of life. So again, just that intention. Simple way to do that is through your breath. Another way of doing it is dropping your awareness down into the body. Both of these are very receptive, brings you into that state of receptivity. And finally, it's creating a space to allow your inner self to bring forth whatever will be most useful. Now, when I say this, I also want to say that when we are in that fight or flight state, this is the kind of thing you hear. I mean, all of you who live in Southern Oregon have probably heard some version of these suggestions many times. And so I really want to honor that the more caught up we are in that fight or flight state, the harder this is, and the more support we deserve. Because often it takes that other person to hold a space for us so that we're able to do these things to a greater extent. The other thing is that the more we become quiet, the more we transform, the more we heal, the more our identity expands, the easier this is. So often the instruction is that this is how we're supposed to start by putting these things into effect. Well, the truth is, it would have happened already if it was that easy. So just to let you know that I am really honoring that we start exactly where we're at, we get as much support as we feel we need, and that as this happens, it becomes more and more and more natural. A wonderful sage one time said that when people meditated to wake up, they had it backwards. Because he said that when somebody wakes up, they naturally meditate. There's a natural stillness. And that actually they thought that if they could copy people who were awake, that then they would wake up. And it was not actually true. And he actually had other suggestions for helping people to wake up. But it's the same with these things. It's that you do them because you already know this. Some part of you already knows this. So that each time you do this, you're nourishing and connecting with that part of yourself. You're allowing those brain pathways that represent these kinds of beings and doings to grow and strengthen, to get shorter and faster. You're starting to set up those detour signs in your brain. So just to know that this process can be real for you. It can take as long as it wants, and please don't feel that this is something else that should start to elicit more of that New Age guilt and inner judgment, that we just do it in our own pace and in our own time, and that the more we can drop in and allow ourselves to do that, the more we'll find that it's easier and easier to do. So this you don't have to read. It's very small and it's really just for me. But what I'd like you to do is just invite you now to just have a little bit of this experience. We've done a little bit of already. But just right now, I think, we've been working a little bit with the breath this evening and with being in the body. And so if you'd like to just come into that state, whatever that is for you, that state of centeredness and more stillness, so that perhaps the way we can start is just by coming into the physical body, just bringing your awareness into your physical body, starting to become aware of any areas that feel tense or tight, uncomfortable in any way, and breathing into those areas for a moment and gathering up any of that tension or tightness or discomfort and breathing it out with your exhale. Breathing into any area that would benefit from being blessed by your awareness right now in the body. Gathering it up. And breathing it out with your exhale. That's right. And then moving your awareness to your emotions. And again, just becoming aware of anything that's rolling around in there. Breathing into those emotions. Just taking a moment to acknowledge them, blessing them again with your awareness, and then breathing them out with your exhale, letting them go. Breathing into your emotions, acknowledging and blessing and breathing them out. Moving your awareness now to your thoughts. And again, just noticing for a few moments what's rolling around in your brain and breathing in, breathing into those thoughts and If you find there's extra thoughts in there, just gathering them up and breathing them out with your exhale, or just breathing a nice, fresh, cleansing breath into the mind. Breathing it back out. And then feeling back into your body and noticing if there's a place now that draws your awareness. Maybe your heart or your belly, maybe somewhere else. And without anticipating or guessing, trying to analyze, just simply bringing your awareness there. Maybe it's your head. Just bringing your awareness there softly, openly, without judgment, no praise or blame. Just there, open to discovery, perhaps something that you didn't know. Or allowing a question to form, feeling the question as well as thinking it. And dropping it now as though you're dropping it into a deep, deep well. Letting it go. Breathing and opening. Attending to that open, spacious awareness. And allowing the response to form now in its own way and its own time. Something may bubble up in this moment, and perhaps you'll notice something as you're dropping off to sleep tonight or when you wake up in the morning. And you can also now bring your awareness to a symptom that you have, perhaps physical, a pain in the body, a concern about some part of the body, perhaps an emotion that you've noticed popping up a lot, an emotional pain, perhaps something about a thought, and breathing in that warm, healing breath, softening and opening, sending your blessing in as a sensation. Maybe the same kind of sensation as you've received as a warm, loving touch or gaze. If you want more relaxation in your shoulder, sending the sensation of relaxation into your shoulder. And your muscles will understand that language, that message. Here, this is what I want. Not forcing, not trying, just simply feeling what it is as though it's already there. Oh, it's very good. And so without having to change anything, you can open your eyes. Excuse me. There's a slide that disappeared. It was a quote from Rumi that said, "With love, all pain will turn to medicine." Are there any questions?
Do you think you could do something for autism with hypnotherapy?
I have done things for autism with hypnotherapy. Yeah. In fact, I've worked with a couple of different people that had autism, and just talked, and they moved and jiggled and wiggled and said all kinds of things and didn't believe it would be the slightest bit of help, and came back later. They were both teenagers. And what? What about, oh, younger kids are great. Can I tell you a beautiful story? This isn't specifically about autism, but my daughter, who of course has grown up with hypnotherapy, when she was 6 years old, I went for a parent-teacher conference when she was in first grade, and the teacher reported to me that a little boy had scraped his knee very badly on the playground and was inconsolable. He was just lots of blood, and he was very upset, and there was gravel that they were going to have to clean out, and they couldn't get this child to stop crying. And my daughter went up, and with her little hands, she put them on either side of his knee and said, "What's your favorite color?" And he said, "Blue." And she said, "Okay. So just imagine that a soft blue light is flowing into your knee now." And he was okay. So kids respond very well. And even, actually, it's kids who are younger actually, again, statistically respond very well to hypnotherapy. Yeah. Do you want to ask more specifically? Maybe there's a suggestion I could give?
There's this little girl named Bree, and I babysit her, and I just love her. She's a very extraordinary, and she has she's just so beautiful and so full of love and so full of light. But then little things will upset her so much, little things that you wouldn't even think of. And it's I want her to be more on the joyful side of life. Fear induced spasm by something like the dog dropping a stick, or it's weird things, and sometimes I can't explain it.
Yeah. So does she have any particular emotions that she does?
She likes to shake her hand, and then she'll get me when she's really happy, and we'll dance around in circles, and she likes to hug herself.
And she likes to hug herself. Okay. So in those moments, good night. In those moments when she's hugging her, those moments that you described, does she hug herself in those moments?
No, when she's having bad times, and it's the shaking hand, and then
The biting. Okay. So you can start to talk to her about, you can start to tell her stories. And as she does this, you can start to coordinate your breathing with her shaking her hand. And you can say things like, "It feels so good to shake your hand." And sometimes when you shake your hand, it can start to remind you of, and you can just start to connect handshaking and do it rhythmic so that she goes into a deeper state. Because again, if she's just in her usual state, when you say these things, it's not going to have an effect. But you can kind of go into trance with her and go into your own deeper place and just start to connect this so that automatically, when she starts to do that, it will connect with some of these other things. Yeah. Anybody else? Any questions or comments? Anything?
I have a question, Rochelle. I can't remember exactly. You said something like allow space between who you are and who you wish you were. And I have an interpretation of what I think you mean by that, but I'm wondering if you could offer us a practical example or just define what you mean by that.
Yeah, often we're just jumping so quickly, aren't we, between who we are and who we think we should be. And even if that should be is really positive, there's something about it that's very diminishing because it's still not really accepting who we are. And so it's just to take a moment to put that whole idea of identity aside, whether it's good identity or bad identity, and just live in that space just for a moment. Is that help to clarify?
Would you call that acceptance?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Acceptance is what you're
Yeah.
saying by that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Acceptance and openness to see, who am I if I just for a moment stop identifying myself or trying to move into another identity? What if I just forget about identity for a second and just see what's here? So thank you all so much. It's beautiful.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.